Hello, welcome to Draft Day. This is episode 3 of Draft Day. I'm John Fleming. I am one of the hosts of Draft Day, alongside the other host of Draft Day, Jason Bradshaw. How you doing, Jason?
Oh, John, if I was any better, I'd be, I'm not going to lie. Hear people use it all the time, but I never know how to actually finish that sentence. Like if I was any better, I'd be dead. Is that you must not be doing very good if that's, I don't know.
Pretty grim.
Yeah, I mean, and it's like, I'm doing pretty good.
Yeah, I mean, the whole institution of asking somebody how they're doing is kind of like silly because you're kind of expecting them to basically connote through their words that they're like a 6 out of 10. Pretty good, If someone's like, I'm doing unbelievable, or if somebody says they're doing terrible, you're going to have follow-up questions, and it's impossible to shake that.
To be fair, like in public, I'll do that to like people sometimes, like the checker at the grocery store, just to like throw them off because they're expecting you to say fine and to move on. But, just be like, man, I tell you, it's been a day. And then, start to go and be like, sorry, you don't need to hear it. But I'm weird like that. So, it's fine.
I mostly just try to avoid talking to checkers. I feel bad.
Self-checkout
guy? Sometimes because I'm trying to avoid talking to people, which, like, I am all for giving people jobs, even if it's busy work, but also I kind of just want you to scan the stuff and move on. But
I mean, I literally at a Walmart, at a local Walmart where I am, we were there one day, and it was after they just put in like most of the aisles being self-checkout, and I swear I thought I saw a bunch of, we'll say, more seasoned human beings that were about to riot because there was only one checkout lane where they could go to have somebody help them. So,
yeah, I mean, usually it kind of depends how much stuff I have. If I have like for instance, yesterday I went to a grocery store after work. I got like 5 or 6 things, and I just went self-checkout. But if I was getting like a cart full of stuff, I would go through the actual line.
I mean, as somebody who, I'm fairly extroverted myself. However, my wife is an extreme introvert. And I think if given the, choice, like I've done full grocery trips in a self-checkout with her before because she doesn't want to have to talk to people. But then at the same time, then she gets mad at me for how slow I do things because I don't really move fast, but.
Gotcha. Well, you just soak it in the day. You're just enjoying surroundings.
I mean, it's nice to not be in the home. I work from home, so it's nice to get out of the house when I can.
Yeah.
Anyway, we're not here to talk about my life.
Yeah, we're here to redraft a draft, but before we do that, and I told you like a minute before we started recording this was going to happen.
I have no idea what this is.
Well, you know that it's trivia. You have a bit of trivia. This is a little bit of a hallmark of podcasts that I've done is sort of doing trivia. Usually it's more on topic because this trivia has nothing to do with drafts. It has nothing to do with sports, but this is the sort of thing that we would just kind of discuss in conversations throughout the time that we've known each other. So it felt appropriate to convey it with the group. This is the game that I actually invented on a car ride this last weekend as a passenger. So you may know about this. I'm sure our listeners are maybe at least somewhat familiar with it. But actually, the day we recorded and released our first episode of Draft Day, the Grammy Awards happened.
Okay.
And I, like most sensible people, don't really care about the results of the Grammy Awards. They're completely meaningless in ways that are beyond like any other award, which is meaningless to some degree. This one's completely meaningless to me. And
they're up there with the Golden Globes.
Yeah, but there is something redeeming about the Grammy Awards, which is that basically just like a big TV concert, and that can be fun.
That's right.
And probably the most discussed performance of the night was the duet of Tracy Chapman and Luke Combs performing Fast Car, which is a song originally released by Chapman, covered by Combs last year. People had very strong opinions kind of in all sorts of directions about this. I thought it was like a perfectly good performance. It's not necessarily a thing that I ever need to like a deeper take about. I think the original is a good song. I think the cover is like fine. It's like respectful and whatever. But one take that I saw a lot of that I just couldn't help but react to, and you're not as present on social media for your benefit, I would say, than I am. But one of the big takeaways is a lot of people, especially a lot of people who are a little bit older than us, kind of bragging about how all these people were just discovering Fast Car by Tracy Chapman and how they were on the ground floor. So my reaction was, who doesn't know the song Fast Car by Tracy Chapman? Like, this is not
it's a good question. I mean, my kid knows it. Like, my kid knew the Tracy Chapman version before the Luke Combs version came out. Keep in mind, my son's like 3.5, and he asked for the Tracy Chapman version of that song.
I will grant that I'm pretty sure I didn't know the song when I was 3.5, but I mean, I knew it before the cover and sort of revival.
Like, my dad probably knows the Tracy Chapman song, and my dad is like out of touch with music and pop culture since like the mid 70s.
Yeah. And so I looked it up on Spotify, and as of the night of that performance, Fast Car had 800 million plays on Spotify, which is for a song that was released before like the streaming era, quite a few. And so, and I haven't looked it up since because I assume that the number has probably gone up kind of proportionally because of the hype surrounding the performance at the Grammys.
Sure.
But what I have is a list of 7 songs that I looked up about an hour ago, wrote down how many plays they have on Spotify. And I want you to guess if it has more plays or fewer plays than 800 million of Fast Car.
Oh my gosh.
All right.
I'm going to be terrible at this.
Well, I mean, theoretically, a 50-50 chance, even if you know absolutely nothing about music. So
that's fair.
7 total, so you try to get 4 in order to win the game. The first song on my list is a song that I believe was released maybe, I think, before Fast Car, but certainly around that same era. Welcome to the Jungle by Guns N' Roses. Does it have more or less plays than the 800 million of Fast Car?
All right, so this is one we're kind of setting the tone with how I'm going to start to understand how streamed things are. But I will say, for the sake of this, I think it's maybe more niche, but known. But I'll say it has less than 800 million streams.
That is incorrect. It has 1.108 billion streams. Billion with a B.
Gosh.
The next song is a song that I once on SoundWords, at the time STL, now SoundWords Central, ranked as the single worst number 1 song of the 2010s. That is the song Rude by the band Magic. The Why You Gotta Be So Rude song.
Oh my gosh. Don't you know I'm human too?
God, I hate that song. It's so bad.
Yeah, it's up there with Promiscuous as far as songs that why were they number 1.
Promiscuous is so much better than let's be very, like, Promiscuous is not a great song, but it's so much better.
I mean, to be fair, our disdain for Promiscuous is it kept Crazy by Gnarls Barkley from being number 1.
Yeah. But
okay, so anyway, over under. See, now I've got myself psyched out. I feel like there's a lot of teenage girls that probably loved that song and use Spotify. I'm old and use Amazon and YouTube Music as my streamings. Like, I don't even hardly use Spotify except to listen to Draft Day, of course.
That's right.
I'll say over.
You are correct. It has 1.374 billion plays.
Good night.
All right. Next up, we're going with a song that is more from our high school years rather than car era or streaming era. We have Sugar We're Going Down by Fall Out Boy.
Oh man. If this was just like music video plays between VH1 and MTV2, it'd still probably be over.
Was this quiz more than you bargained for?
I've been dying to tell you everything. Anyway. Yeah, I mean, they were such a flash in the pan. I'll say it's under.
Under is correct. It is at 754 million. So not under by a ton, but it is under.
Yeah,
Zoomers seem to really like that song.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like it introduced us to Fall Out Boy. I won't lie, like there's a few Fall Out Boy songs that make their way into my I listen to them, but
yeah, like I'm more of a Dance Dance guy from that album.
Little less 16 Candles, you know.
All right, so you were at 2 out of 3. Speaking of Fall Out Boy, and I say that in the meanest way possible, We Didn't Start the Fire by Billy Joel.
Shoot. I mean, to be fair, every junior in high school taking U.S. history should have that song on a repeat, and they'd be able to pass most of their exams.
How else would you know that JFK was blown away?
I mean, what else do you really have to say? I mean, fun fact that I always love to point out is that, in Billy Joel's We Didn't Start the Fire, we also have a guy mentioned who is in the first line of Dexy's Midnight Runner song, Come On Eileen, which is Johnny Ray. So, I mean, I'm stalling as I'm trying to figure out what to do here. Let's go. I'll go over.
It is under. It is at 457 million plays.
So you're telling me that We Didn't Start the Fire has 300 million less streams on Spotify than Sugar We're Going Down.
That's right.
God.
Anyway.
Yeah.
Number 5, it is the song that was the inspiration for a 2019, I think it was, feature film. That is the song Yesterday by the Beatles. So obviously the song that's quite a bit pre-streaming era.
Yeah.
But also is by
the Beatles,
the most famous band in the world, yeah.
Yeah. But it's also, I don't know that I would consider it to be one of the more streamed songs by that band either. I'll say under.
Under is correct. It is at 596 million plays. So you have 2 more opportunities to get a winning record. We're going to go with a rock band, but we're going to go with a little bit more recent, a little bit closer to the Fall Out Boy era. We have the song Best of You, the Foo Fighters.
I've got another confession to make. You know what? Just because I think I'm going to say it's over.
Okay. It is under. It is at 601 million plays, which means we're going to go down to the 7th song to determine whether you win this game.
Set it up just for the dramatic effect, guys.
Sure.
This is all for you.
So this is a song that is by far the newest song that has been quizzed so far. So this is a song that has had less time to accumulate plays, but is firmly in the streaming era. It's an extremely popular artist across the world. A song tied into an extremely popular entertainment product of last year, and that is the song Dance the Night by Dua Lipa. The song from the Barbie movie. That have more or less than 800 million plays.
People, oh my gosh. I'm kind of familiar with this song. People people love them some.
For anyone familiar with the movie but not pop music in general, this is the song that they do the coordinated dance to.
I mean, she's big. All right, just because I'm a glutton for punishment and probably going to lose this, I will say over.
Seems very not confident in your answer.
I'm not.
It is under. It is at 697 million plays.
Gen Z, you let me down.
That was our... to be fair, Dua Lipa is a millennial, but...
Yeah, but...
I'm on the younger millennial side.
Yeah, it's, I don't know. I feel like we're firmly in the, middle millennial, right in the heart of it, but...
Yes, correct.
On those last two, I was even like, I thought you were trying to trick me. That's why I went over.
All right. Well, I'm glad I could play a little psychology with you, but we move on from that game. We'll hopefully have some more fun and merriment in the future. But for now, we move on to our first draft in Major League Baseball.
Woo!
This is a big moment for me personally as a St. Louis Cardinals blogger. We are discussing the 2009 Major League Baseball draft. A couple of fun facts about this draft. This was the first draft that was ever televised live. It was the first round was televised on MLB Network. Are you familiar with the fun fact about the players that attended this draft?
I don't believe that I am.
Okay, so one total player attended the draft, and the reason I suspect is because they weren't like paying for players to come out. So like Stephen Strasburg was the number one overall pick in this draft, but he was from San Diego, and the draft was being held at MLB Studios in Secaucus, Jersey. So would have been a bit of a trek for him. That said, there was one player from the state of New Jersey who attended the draft, and that player was Mike Trout. So not bad for MLB. So this is
I've never heard
the thing about
who is that guy.
Well, we'll see if he comes up in the redraft. I think there's a possibility
okay.
of it. So the thing about this draft is it became the Mike Trout draft because of the fact that he became like the best player in baseball since he got drafted. At the time, though, very much was the Stephen Strasburg draft. This was a guy who was super hyped, and like I'm not somebody that despite the fact that I follow pro baseball a lot, I don't really follow like amateur baseball. This was like the most hyped prospect in my time paying attention to baseball closely. And as far as I can tell, the most hyped prospect since like Alex Rodriguez, who was 16 years prior. And I mean, I will give away that I don't believe he's going to be the number one overall pick in our redraft, but he was a guy who for a few years like really met the hype, and it was like a big deal, like who Stephen Strasburg was. And
yeah, for sure.
Yeah,
and I'm with you in that I wasn't even paying that close of attention to baseball. I mean, this draft was happening not too long after we met, actually.
It's true, yeah.
So but even I remember just like ESPN was covering this dude like in college, like before that, because they're like, this dude's going to be the number one overall pick. He's, going to come in and pitch in the MLB day one, which was sort of like unheard of. In my limited time. So
here's one of my favorite facts to point out about Stephen Strasburg and how hyped he was. I am currently on the Wikipedia page of the Washington Metro, which is their mass transit system. Stephen Strasburg's debut was the 8th busiest day in the history of the Washington Metro. Number 1 was a presidential inauguration. Number 2 was the 2017 Women's March. A bunch of cherry blossom festival days. The day before the first Obama inauguration, and then it's Stephen Strasburg's debut. It's crazy how big of a deal this was. And he ended up striking out 14 batters in his first game. So he I remember watching this just like in like my bedroom as a 21-year-old. Yeah, 21-year-old. Yeah. And just being like, okay, I'm watching the future. And obviously we'll get into kind of what happened in his career, but I mean, he's going to get redrafted here. I don't think there's it would be very weird if he weren't in the top 20.
Yeah, I agree.
But in addition to the Strasburg of it all, in addition to the Mike Trout of it all, this is a big draft for us as St. Louis Cardinals fans because, oh my, are there some St. Louis Cardinals connections. The draft itself produced 5 players who were members of the 2013 World Series team, and also a bunch of players who were part of the current team because the Cardinals are old now. But regardless, there's gonna be a lot of St. Louis Cardinals players mentioned in this draft.
I had no idea that this was the draft of some of these guys when you had brought it up, and I was like, oh dang,
Yeah, I knew about the ones who were drafted by the Cardinals. I did not realize how many future Cardinals there were here, but we'll get to them, sure.
Mm-hmm.
Right, and so as we did our first draft, we decided who would get first overall pick by a game of iMessage pool. I have carried on my my victorious ways in earning these draft picks, so I have the number 1 overall pick. I am going to go ahead and select a young man. Well, not a young man really anymore, but was a young man at the time out of Millville, New Jersey. I'm taking Mike Trout for the extremely obvious reasons. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time really discussing this one because, there just isn't really an argument for anybody else. He's by far, by any metric, he is by far the best player out of this draft. He's the leader in WAR. He's the leader in WAR 7, which measures the 7 best years the players had. 11-time All-Star, 9-time Silver Slugger. He's received MVP votes in 10 different seasons, including winning 3 MVPs. When he first came up, you could argue that his rookie year, he was the best fielder, the best base runner, and like a top 5 hitter in baseball off the jump. Obviously, he slowed down a little bit in the last couple of years because of injuries, but he is he could retire today and he's a first ballot Hall of Famer. And there are other guys in this draft that I think probably will be Hall of Famers. There's nobody that's nearly as obvious as Mike Trout, though.
Yeah, he, what's not to say about him? If you're listening to this podcast, you know who Mike Trout is. Like, he's, sort of revolutionized the game. We'd heard a lot of things about these guys that have maybe been hyped to be that, like a name like Bryce Harper comes to mind, a guy that's like, oh, he could do it all. And not to say that Bryce Harper's not really good, but Mike Trout came in, we're like, who's this guy? I mean, and yeah, there's not really much else to say. Was the best player in baseball until he got usurped by a guy who had to do it pitching and batting on his own team, basically. Yeah. So
Trout should be honored that he is now the best player on his own team again.
Yeah, but not in his city. But
sure. Well, Anaheim.
Yeah.
Unless you're going to go with Trevor Zegras.
I mean, I don't. Not to go hockey, but I could argue that Trevor Zegras isn't the best player on his own team. But
yeah, but I figured he'd be the most famous.
Yeah, probably. But all right,
I'm gonna go on a limb and guess that Trout was probably number 1 on board.
Yeah, by a large margin.
Yes,
but at number 2, gonna get our first Cardinals connection out of the way. I'm gonna take the 2022 National League MVP, Paul Goldschmidt, at number 2.
Yep. The guy who was not drafted very high.
No, he was, drafted in the 8th round at pick number 246.
At Texas State.
So, at a Texas State in San Marcos, Texas. Lovely place. I've been there a few times for previous jobs. Have a Texas State hat, actually. So I'm repping all our Texas fans. But he, here's a guy that when you look at, obviously finally got that MVP in 2022. And that was after he cooled off significantly to end the season as well.
Yes, he did.
And had he stayed in with, but was runner up for MVP twice, finished 3rd once. This was, those were all in Arizona.
Yeah,
multiple All-Star games, Silver Sluggers, Gold Glove. I mean, there's not a lot that the guy doesn't do well. He's got.
Yeah, I think he's one of those guys that, when he was in Arizona, especially, was sort of perennially, like, you would think of him as one of those underrated players in baseball, and I think that's like now caught up where he is properly rated as like extremely good. And like
Yeah,
he's at this point he's in his was he 36, 37 at
36.
this point?
36.
Yeah, like obviously you're probably thinking he'll be good for another year or two, but you're not expecting him to be his peak level anymore. But you're getting so much production prior to that it's hard to argue. He was number 2 on my board as well. I think that the gap between 2 and 3 is quite a bit less than 1 and 2, but I think you made the right pick.
Yeah, you'll hear obviously some other guys, but for me, and the other thing too, it's for the most part, I think he's had pretty good longevity. Outside of, I mean, most seasons at least over 100 games. Most he's playing 150 plus. So a guy that who knows, even in years to come, like with the introduction of the DH, if it's too hard, he may be a guy you're like, if a team's wanting a guy that can still hit the ball, but into the field, but it stinks because he's still a really good defensive first baseman even now. So
yeah, definitely a well-rounded player, a player that like was pretty good at stealing bases in his prime too. I guess the lack of positional versatility would be the one knock against him, but also he's always been a good enough hitter that you would want him to play anywhere in the field. And even the years that he had that were like slightly down years, like his 2019, his first year in St. Louis. But if you look at his numbers from that year, like, oh, he was still like a well above average hitter. He just wasn't an MVP.
Yeah, he actually finished 20th in MVP voting that year. But 34 homers, 97 RBIs. But the big dip you saw is when he hit 260. And then obviously last season 268. So you maybe wonder how he is with age, but the longevity, 100, like you said, 158 steals to go with his 340 home runs, 293 average, and 1122 RBIs. Yeah, I take that.
Yeah, I think he's I think he's probably going to make the Hall of Fame. Might not be a first ballot guy, but just a C accumulation. And I think the MVP probably helps. I will say, and I was actively blogging about the Cardinals, throughout his entire tenure, but certainly during his MVP season. I actually did not think that he was the most valuable Cardinal that year. The guy that I thought was the most valuable Cardinal is the guy that I have number 3 on my board, and I'm going to make the number 3 pick, which is Nolan Arenado. I have a reputation for being a Nolan Arenado hater, and I can explain all of those things as well. But any like hard number, as far as he has the third highest WAR 7 in this group. He has 10 Gold Gloves. I think that some of those are reputation based, but you still break it down, and like 5 or 6 of them are fully legit. A guy who like his raw offensive numbers were inflated for a long time because of Colorado, but he came to St. Louis. He was still hitting a bunch of home runs. He was still an offensive force. Kind of a player that. And he's going to be under contract for a bit longer, so we'll see how this plays out. But the fact also that he is, several years younger than Paul Goldschmidt. He's going into his age 33 season. A little past his prime, probably. Kind of looked like he lost a step defensive last season, but still somebody that I expect will be really good. Doesn't have an MVP, which is, I guess, the one knock in comparison to Trout and Goldschmidt, but also nobody else that's on the board has an MVP. So I'm perfectly content with that pick.
Yeah, I think he, like you, number 3 on my board, clear number 3. Like I said, in terms of WAR, it's a pretty big drop off after him, and to what I think we'll get into an interesting kind of next section as they're a lot closer. But yeah,
there's a lot of good players left, but I think the top 3 is pretty crystal clear. I think top 1 is pretty clear, and then 2 and 3.
And 2 and 3.
I you make a case for Arenado over Goldschmidt. I personally had Goldschmidt higher, but I could see it. But
it's it's one of those things too where I'm not necessarily one of those people, but because he still did and everything, people are going to point to when he was younger playing in Colorado and all that stuff, obviously. And a guy that, like you said, it's his numbers speak for themselves. He's, like I said, in 2022, he finished third in MVP voting, and he may have honestly deserved to be second in MVP voting, but you get team splitting vote or whatever that could happen type things. He's a guy that it may be interesting. I haven't compared his statistics to other third basemen as far as a Hall of Fame case goes. I think obviously being a little younger, he can help himself quite a bit there.
Yeah.
But seeing how hard it was for even watching Scott Rowland and things like that, they're different types of players, but they do a lot of the same things. So but a guy who, when we're looking at Goldschmidt, he's only got 60 fewer RBIs than Paul Goldschmidt, and is 4 years younger than him. So
and came up a couple years later as well.
Yeah. So it's, if you look at productivity on a per game basis or, that type of thing, which I don't think people tend to do a whole lot, but, also third base versus first base, you tend to have maybe a little more power and stuff as first baseman in terms of hitting and stuff, but obviously factors into the WAR and such. But
yeah, and theoretically, if Arenado, loses a step at third base, he can move over to first base, depending on what happens with Paul Goldschmidt. I suspect that this will probably be Goldschmidt's last year playing first base for the Cardinals, but there's a lot of time between now and when decisions are made. I actually think that Arenado probably has more of an inside track to make the Hall of Fame than Goldschmidt, just because he has that defensive reputation. I don't agree with that, but I think that they're both guys that will at least be highly considered by people.
Yeah.
All right, you up at number 4.
Oh man, this is where it gets interesting. So, okay, I'm gonna do it. I'll go away from the WAR is in terms of ranking guys now, and I'm actually gonna take the number 1 overall pick, Stephen Strasburg, at 4.
Nice.
One thing being in terms of this draft, and I'm sure this is probably the case, but I think you could say that he's by far, maybe with one other guy, best pitcher in this draft, even statistically speaking. And like you said, it's you think about all the reasons to take him, but for one thing, think of just the money that this dude made for a mid to lower market tier team like the Nationals. And played his entire career there too. Didn't move on. Obviously, what would he have been?
They might regret the fact that he hasn't moved on at this point, given
yeah.
I
mean, but he's a guy what would he have become? Obviously, without the injuries and that's always the big what if with him. But like you said, when he came out, he was the first guy I remember. Now it seems like every other guy that comes up is throwing 98, 99, over 100. But when this dude's a starter, coming out pumping stuff, you're just holy cow, throwing change-ups in the 90s and stuff.
Other than May Verlander, I can't think of a starting pitcher prior to Strasburg where it was just this guy's throwing heat like he's a closer.
Right. Yeah,
it was incredibly fun to watch because it was as much as it can be to watch guys who have good breaking stuff and as much back as they have for the Clayton Kershaw types who are not elite velocity guys. They have good velocity, but it's mostly because they have really good breaking stuff. It's also fun to just watch a guy just humiliate batters, and Strasburg had that ability.
Yeah, it's it's always fun. I mean, he's a guy. I mean, had a 113.62 record. Not that means a whole lot. 3.24 ERA, 1.1 WHIP for his career. Had 4 home runs as a batter, so big up for.
I forgot that he was a good batter.
Yeah, I mean, and it's he's definitely not the pitcher in this draft that I would most associate with batting. That's my tease there. But he
has a Silver Slugger, though.
Yeah, he does. But there's one guy I feel like who got way overblown that he was, and you probably know who I'm talking about. He may have a Cardinals connection.
I believe I know who you're talking about, yes.
But, but to stay on Strasburg, like you said, it's just the sheer dominance and like what he did for your team, and you could argue maybe even the sport. I mean, he was the guy that all the high school kids were modeling themselves after. Every kid who pitched wanted to be Stephen Strasburg. Like, he came in being that guy. It kind of shifted us away because, like you said, nobody's throwing heat like that except maybe Verlander. But then, when we were growing up, like the guy that, it was the Maddoxes of the world that you like were like, oh yeah, you watch that, or like I remember being amazed at, like, as a Cardinals fan, like at Matt Morris's breaking stuff.
From like our childhood, I think that the closest comp you'd have to Strasburg, and it's lefty versus righty, so it seems a little weird, but like Randy Johnson just being like overpowering velocity.
Yeah, I mean, and obviously you've had those guys where it's the Randy Johnson, Nolan Ryan before him, you know, but it seemed like Strasburg kind of, well, those guys at times, there was edge maybe to them, or just straight control issues with Ryan.
And Johnson early on too.
And Johnson, like Strasburg, he kind of just like came in and like, he wasn't like a larger than life character, like off the field. He just kind of let his his pitching, if you will, kind of be the dominant thing about it. He wasn't, like I said, he wasn't a huge personality, doing the look at me stuff. Not that I really don't care if players do that. If you can get the money, be you. But, it was, like you said, it revolutionized and maybe brought the MLB draft into more of a lexicon, than it was.
Definitely.
Because, like so many people, obviously, you're not watching the entire thing with the tons of rounds. But, and let's be honest, for a number one overall pick in baseball, in a baseball draft, to have, if you end up with a guy who had Strasburg's career, like statistically, you're probably pretty happy.
Yeah.
I mean, Trout was a first rounder, but the other two guys ahead of him were, a second rounder and an eighth rounder in this draft.
Right. Yeah.
So
here is, and I was going to save this for once Strasburg got drafted, but this is sort of a galaxy brain take. If you're the Washington Nationals, would you take Mike Trout? Because here's the thing about Strasburg. He was such a huge part of like the identity of making Nationals relevant. Because the first few years at the Washington Nationals, after they moved from Montreal, they were just like the most nondescript team in the world. They were mediocre. It was like Jose Vidro and Livan Hernandez and like sort of those, like that tier of player. They were playing at RFK Stadium, and he just like made it an event. And then, leading up to when they won the World Series in 2019, he was the World Series MVP. I don't think there's any question that Trout's a better player, but I'm not sure that the Nationals necessarily like trade that. I mean, granted, if you could somehow trade that and then the Angels get Strasburg, the Angels are saying no quicker than the Nationals are, but
sure. But like you said,
there's something about
it made him relevant. Even if it wasn't competing wise right away, I don't have the standings up in front of me for how they kind of finished throughout Strasburg. And obviously, he wasn't, they had a lot of other elements in 2019 and things like that. But, you have to wonder if Strasburg doesn't go there, like say, build out the culture, do they get some of the guys that they did end up getting for those teams? I mean, and I know people talk about Trout all the time, but it's like, I mean, Trout hasn't won a title with the Angels.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of this tricky thing when it comes to like kind of counting the rings with baseball, because you can't do it by yourself. But I think that Strasburg did at least in large part, contribute to this change in the culture of the Nationals, and that that does matter. And for instance, I'm not going to go to it right this second, but the guy that I'm going to draft next, I had higher on my board than Strasburg, but there's no question he did not have as much of an impact with his team as Strasburg has.
Yeah.
It's just not even close.
Yeah.
All right. So I will go ahead and move
set it up and don't leave us hanging.
All right. Number 5, I'm going to go with Kyle Seager. Seager drafted by the Seattle Mariners, number 82 overall. Not as much spectacular stuff as the other players so far. Only one-time All-Star, received MVP votes twice, got a Gold Glove in there. Nothing too flashy in terms of career numbers. His career's over at this point. 12% above league average OPS throughout his career. 242 home runs. Just sort of a steady, good player. Admittedly, not the most exciting pick. I'm not even going to try to couch that. There are guys here that had higher peaks than him. But if you look at, if you go by Jaws 7 or War 7, like mentioned, which is not the end all be all of peak, he is 4th in this class in terms of his best years, and I think there's something to that. And it's a little bit tricky when you're drafting a guy and he's not even the best Major League Baseball player in his own family. But Corey's not available, so I'll take Kyle.
Yeah, I think we've actually gone 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in the order that I've had guys so far. So
nice.
I agree with you.
Right.
But
that is
the narrative of his career, like you said, is probably turned into it's Corey's brother.
That is literally his nickname in Baseball Reference, which is funny. And granted, that was because he had it as a Players Weekend jersey, but
but it's but that's the thing. But like you said, you get a guy who peak year, but almost 1,500 games, 242 homers.
Yeah,
I mean it's 242 more home runs than I have.
And there is something, I think, to the fact that he was the best player for Seattle during obviously a pretty lean time. He never even played in a playoff game, much less won a championship. But he was the main attraction in Seattle prior to Julio Rodriguez arriving. Kind of the guy that sort of the transition between the Felix Hernandez, to some extent Ichiro era, into the much better team they have now. Not a guy who's going to knock anyone's socks off, but I think if you guy at the number 5 overall pick and he ends up being a really good starting player for you, that's something that you're quite happy with.
I agree. All right, going to numero 6. Every time I do this, I always end up veering off of the way I have my list. I could keep going how I have them in order, but I think the more I think about it, I'm going to go away from it. And I guess I'm just going to build my proverbial team around decent defensive first baseman. And I'm going to take Brandon Belt at number 6.
Oh, interesting.
It's one where he's a guy, I'll be honest, I've always liked watching him play. Is there anything spectacular about Brandon Belt? I mean, not particularly.
I kind of think of him as being a poor man's Goldschmidt.
Yeah, it's only hitting 261 in his career. So not as good as Goldschmidt, but I mean defensively, I think pretty well regarded as a defensive first baseman. But playing, pretty consistently for the Giants since came up in 2011. Up until ended up in Toronto last year, but a guy that I don't know. It's one of those weird things. He just compared to, like you said, his peaks maybe not as high, but I think probably more. If you at least look, when he was playing, he had some injuries, but consistent. He was a guy that if he was in your lineup, you kind of knew what you're getting, and has, I mean, a WAR of about 30, 29.6, I think is at least what Baseball Reference has in that career WAR. It's one of those picks where I don't necessarily have statistics would be like, oh yeah, that's a great pick to go with. Given a couple of the other guys that are ahead of him, but I don't know. He's a guy I like consistency, and that's why I settled on him.
Yeah, wasn't quite as high on my board. I had him number 13, I think. Definitely a good player, a solid sort of presence in the lineup. Do you know the story about why the supposed reason Brandon Belt went to Toronto?
I don't think I'm familiar with that.
So allegedly, and this is what he's at least claimed, it has to do with him really, and this dates back to his time playing with the Giants whenever they would travel to Toronto. Apparently, he really likes the chicken fingers at one of the hotels in Toronto. And so,
I mean, that's legendary stuff right there, if that's why he did it.
Like, I think it's very funny, the idea of a player going up to Canada. Obviously going to Canada for the food, you'd think that, they would still want like poutine or something, but no, chicken strips.
I mean,
I never had a chicken strips. Maybe they're great.
Hey man, as a man who has put down a tendy or two in my life, I mean, if that's the case, man, more power to him.
Yeah. Respect. I
think it's a long way from Texas where he's from. So.
Yeah, every once in a while you'll hear people, particularly people who are from like New York or LA, who are talking about major league cities as though like, oh, you can't get a decent such and such food in that city. And it's like, these are all big cities. You can find like, at least a little bit of any given cuisine, and it's not like you're living there all year long. But the idea that the cuisine that just like stood out was because of chicken strips is,
I mean,
once we have a Milwaukee player saying they signed because they wanted to get quality cheese curds throughout the year, I think that's like the apex of what it could be. But I think that going for chicken strips, and it's like at a hotel too. It's not even like through a chain.
I mean, for anybody who doesn't know, I used to work in the hotel business, where I would have to stay on site for weeks sometimes at these hotels, and I still miss some of the food items at those restaurants, I would just like to say. So, shout out to the Renaissance in Glendale, Arizona, right next to the stadium. Great food there.
That'd be next to the Cardinal Stadium, right?
Yes, I forget what it's called now. State Farm, maybe now, or used to be University. Right, used to be University of Phoenix Stadium, but.
All right, so number 7 pick, I'm going to go with my third straight player that I associate primarily as a third baseman, past and future St. Louis Cardinal, Matt Carpenter. Carpenter, the number 399 pick in this draft. I think a lot of people who are listening to this are familiar with his work, but this was a guy who was a 3-time All-Star. He's got a Silver Slugger, MP vote in 3 different seasons. 2013 is kind of one of the like legendary Cardinals seasons because he got moved to second base in spring training, and he turned out to be like statistically the best second baseman in baseball that year. Didn't stay there; mostly played third base. I think a lot of Cardinals fans, towards the end of his time in St. Louis, got a little sick of him because he had declined both offensively and defensively, and his decline was part of what got Nolan Arenado to St. Louis. So again, tying in with guys in this draft with the Cardinals. Obviously, he had that huge tear with the Yankees. Dropped off a little bit with San Diego last year. I don't think there's a lot of expectation he's going to be like amazing with the Cardinals again this year, but a player who had some really good seasons. I kind of like the idea of getting a guy who can play multiple positions, even if he's not like an ace fielder at any of them, but just the idea of somebody who has that sort of versatility. And I think one of the great bargains of this draft in terms of there's looking at my board, there's only one other guy in my top 20 who was picked lower than Carpenter, and he's like several spots down. Carpenter was my number 5 player, so I've gotten my 1, 3, 4, and 5, and
wow,
I'm pretty happy with that.
So yeah, he was. I had Carpenter a little lower, and maybe it's bias of, I think I had him at 9 on mine. And to be fair, like 5 through 15, maybe 16 even in my draftings is fairly close, like kind of a thing. But, Carpenter, obviously a guy, when he was on, and those high years were about as high as you could get. Had everything.
The 2018 run in particular of like the first third or first like fourth or so of the season, he was like barely playable. The last month of the season, he was terrible. But all the time between then, he like got MVP votes based on how good that was.
Yeah, and it's a guy who, he was the guy. The way that you were sort of like, you say you had a reputation as an Arenado hater. My lovely father was, for the longest time, a Matt Carpenter hater, which made no sense to me. It's, hating a guy that you really didn't have expectations of, but he, to me, just the tail off hurts him maybe compared to some of these other players, but
Sure.
You're going to take him on your team. He's, obviously seeing him play more often than a lot of these guys. If anybody couldn't tell, baseball is not where my knowledge base super lies outside of guys in the Cardinals. So like,
which is a very helpful thing in this draft, to be fair.
It's, but at the same time, and maybe it was me fighting the bias as far as why I didn't think it was high, but you can't argue with, production, and especially, with, you said, jack of, more trades, master of none sort of thing when it comes to the fielding positions. But I mean, even played a decent number of first, I think, at times for the Cardinals. So, and we'll see what he does this year. I'm not one of those people that thinks he's going to be awesome. I expect to see him every so often, and I hope that is how we see it.
Yeah, what I put whenever I wrote about the move after it happened, it was basically just like, I don't hate it in a vacuum because he's playing for basically free, but like, they could have found somebody better than this. Like, there's actually a guy on my board who is a few years younger that I was like, this guy actually would have made a lot more sense for the Cardinals, but obviously they didn't go that route. You are up at number 8.
I am up at number 8. All right. Well, then I am going to go with. I'm between 2. Let's see him. The list is always a reflection of how I felt at a certain time. Forget it. I'll do it. I'm going to go with no fun intro to this one. Except for I can say position utility type thing. I'm going to go DJ LeMahieu with my next pick.
He was number 10 on my board. So,
another guy, not going to jump off the page. Did have a few like ridiculous years.
Yeah.
I mean, he finished 3rd in AL MVP voting in 2020. He hit, am I reading this right? Where it says he hit 364 that year.
I mean, it's 2020, so that's
but even and hit 348 in Colorado in 2016.
Which the batting average in Colorado, you always grain of salt, but still.
I mean, 15th in MVP voting. 2020 season, but even with it, a guy who, like you can play, the corners in second, in terms of what he plays on the infield. But a guy who's played pretty consistently. I mean, been a staple in the Yankees lineup since they got him.
And the fact that he can move around a little bit has been an asset to them because they've had like Gleyber Torres, they've had other guys who can't, but he can just kind of move around, and a guy who can hit well and play really strong defense at a premium position. I kind of one of those guys where I wasn't really sure exactly where to put him on my list, but Yeah, at number 8, I like that pick for you.
Yeah, and I mean, like you said, 4 Gold Gloves, 2-time All-Star, 3-time All-Star, 3-time All-Star, and even a couple of Silver Slugger awards. I mean, it's a guy that not to just make this purely Cardinals, but a guy akin to maybe a Tommy Edman has turned out to be within the Cardinals. Only he did this for a lot longer of a period. Has done this for a lot longer period of time. Career WAR of over 30, if I remember right. 31 and a half B WAR. And a 292 career hitter. So I mean,
good selection.
Yeah.
One of those like randomly tall infielders. Always a fan of the Matt Carpenter's one of those guys too, where kind of deceptive. I think Troy Tulowitzki's the king of it. To speak of middle infielders from Colorado, but
Colorado infielder seems to be a theme for the first 8 picks, I guess.
It's true. Number 9 pick, I'm going to go with my first pitcher, second pitcher overall. I'm going to go with Dallas Keuchel. Keuchel was selected by the Astros. Has kind of bounced around a little bit of late, but guy who really had a solid peak in there. 5-time Gold Glove winner, to the extent that anyone cares about that for pitchers. Received Cy Young votes twice, won a Cy Young award in there. Was kind of the ace whenever the Astros started to become what they eventually became. Obviously, once Verlander arrived, he became the number 1 show in town. But Dallas Keuchel is just a guy who had that kind of ace potential early on. Admittedly, not quite the longevity that I would want out of a pitcher at number 9, but a guy whose peak I think makes up for that. And so, yeah, that is. He's not the most exciting pitcher to watch, kind of the opposite of Strasburg, because he's much more of a finesse guy. But results are there, so I will stand by it.
Yeah, I think I had him right there. I think I had him in my 11 spot.
Yeah, other than the top few, we actually are kind of differentiating a little bit, which I like.
Yeah, I think it's, I'll make a point with my next pick to him to not necessarily give away, but yeah, I mean, he's a guy who, like you said, it looked like when he was kind of hitting his stride that you thought he was going to be the guy for a long time. And then
yeah.
I don't. Where is he most recently? Is it Minnesota, where he's been?
Let me double check that. We're at the point in the off season where I have forgotten where guys have moved around to.
Yeah.
Last year he was with Minnesota. I think he still is.
Say.
Yeah, I mean at this point he's also 36, so kind of probably a little bit past his.
Yeah, he may be a free agent. I don't even know. Yeah, I don't know his contract.
He is a free agent. If the Cardinals are wanting some more depth, just think about it.
Hey, I don't know though. I think I saw a headline today about the Cardinals. It's age is just a number when it comes to the Cardinals rotation or something. I'm like, but
I mean, why not just get one more old guy in there?
I mean, that's yeah.
Okay, Steven Matz is going to be their youngest pitcher. It's going to be awesome. Speaking of 2009 draftees.
Yeah.
I think four of the 5 pitchers. It's possible that 4 of the 5 pitchers in the Cardinals rotation are guys from this draft, none of whom we've selected yet. But
yeah. Well, oh my!
Actually, no, it's 3 of 5.
3 of 5, yeah. Unless Shelby's coming back. All right. Well, I'm glad you didn't take a pitcher that I had above Dallas Keuchel. That I will take my next pick, and I'll go with Zach Wheeler.
Yeah.
Next, Like
I
you
have
said,
logic behind this, but yeah, I get it.
Like on the up and up, I think too. I mean, I think Wheeler's kind of hitting his stride. Obviously finished second in Cy Young in the 2021 season. Won a Gold Glove last year, so that's cool. Finished sixth in Cy Young voting, but it seems that he's found something in Philadelphia that maybe he didn't have.
Definitely, yeah.
With the Mets, just a guy who's consistency, and I think with him and Keuchel, for me, it's maybe like you said, it's that longevity piece of he's obviously I think about 2 or 3 years younger than Keuchel, as well, but
yeah, Wheeler was out of high school. Keuchel was out of Arkansas.
Yeah, so and didn't debut in the MLB until 2013. Wheeler, but a guy coming off throwing 192 innings last year, pretty decent stats. I mean, a guy who I think this is me maybe more than some of these other guys were like, okay, they've kind of solidified that, putting him a little higher because I may be betting that I'm going to be able to get something out of the next 2-3 years, especially out of him, that would maybe elevate him to even moving up. If we were to do this draft even 4 or 5 years from now. But I think yeah, just a guy who I think of any of the pitchers in this draft maybe still has the most in the tank. No offense to Cardinal pitchers who have not been mentioned yet, but
Certainly true.
And frankly, for being a pitcher, he's also in a better situation in Philadelphia right now. That doesn't hurt.
Yeah, I would agree with that. So the thing with Wheeler, so I haven't introduced this yet because it mostly hasn't been relevant to my picks, but I actually invented a new stat for the sake of my evaluating here. I don't love the name of it. I called it CC WAR, which is basically a WAR that's weighted towards your cost control years. And the reason I kind of shied away from Zach Wheeler is if you draft a guy, you get him for the first 3 years at league minimum, the next 3 years at arbitration. And because Wheeler was a slow starter, he factored he was actually number 29 on my board by that metric. I ranked him a lot higher than that overall. I had him 14th, but just sort of for perspective on kind of where I was coming from. That said, I'm now going to draft the guy that I had at number 5 on the CC WAR and number 7 overall on my board. I'm going to go with Brian Dozier, a guy who, a little bit quicker in terms of hitting the ground running. Just, he was drafted as a shortstop by the Twins, but primarily played second base. Guy who was drafted out of college and, was a very solid, maybe not like a superstar level player, but he was a guy, he was an all-star, won a Gold Glove, got MVP votes on 3 different occasions, which I believe is second highest of guys who remain on board. Just kind of a guy who factors into a solid lineup. He had a run with the Dodgers, and if a team that has that kind of ability has use for him, that seems like a player that I at the number 11 pick. Because once you get to the baseball draft, just sort of generally, you really kind of don't know what you're getting in terms of top guys. So of the guys we drafted so far, the only other guy drafted in the top 24 after Strasburg, Zach Wheeler, who went 6th. It really does become like very much a wild guessing game. But little bit like in the same spirit as like Mike Seager, Dallas Keuchel. They're not the most exciting picks, but they're guys I think can be good contributors for good teams.
Yeah, I think for sure. And he's a guy who, I don't know why. I always just, whenever I would watch him play, I just, it's a terrible, I hate describing players, but just gritty, just kind of a grinder type guy with, that you just watch play, and he's a guy who, like you said, super low draft pick. If you're looking in terms of value, I could see how he's high in your CC War statistic, as I'm just going to now refer to it as your human cost benefit analysis.
Yeah, I feel kind of bad doing this, to be clear, but I'm kind of trying to think about it from the perspective of a general manager.
But it makes sense in the sense of you're looking, or maybe a better way to put it is return on investment. It's an ROI, if you will. If if your investment's lower, you hope for that higher return.
I should point out that my top 3 guys in the stat were Mike Trout, Paul Goldschmidt, Nolan Arenado. It's not that far flung, but just with certain guys at the margins, it becomes.
Yeah, and to be fair, 5 to 12 when you're talking about the entire draft in terms of everything, I don't think it's that crazy, but or 5 to 11, excuse me. He's this 11th pick, right?
Yep. Number 12 pick is yours.
Yep, number 12 pick is mine. And I don't know why I don't want to make this pick, but I'll make it. I'm going to take JD Martinez.
Yeah, he's the other guy with more All-Star games that I had alluded to previously.
He's a guy in terms of career WAR. Actually, I think ranked 7th in this class. Or in terms of B WAR.
Yeah.
And I think you alluded to him earlier. I mean, if we're gonna go with guys in this draft that were like steal of the draft kind of a thing, JD Martinez drafted in the 20th round at pick number 611.
Yeah, good player. The first guy drafted so far out of Nova Southeastern University. There are 2 other players on my extended board who also went to Nova Southeastern University, which is wild. We'll see if we get to them.
I learned about Nova Southeastern University because of this draft. Like, I won't lie to you. And obviously, and you had texted me about this when we were sort of setting our parameters, so we weren't, working from the same list, but not having to sort through 611 guys plus.
Yeah, I will say this is a much bigger pain than the other sports in terms of extracting lists to build from. Because one rule that we set, and I think we actually referenced this on a previous episode, but we're only draft guys who signed, because we don't want to be like guys who were high school picks and end up going to college, because then that's sort of outside the spirit of who's getting drafted and where. But that still leaves like a ton of players, and there's so many players that you can't just export one big file from Baseball Reference, which is a bummer. But once you get past the first few rounds, it slows down dramatically. So there's that.
Yeah, and I think too, with Martinez, I mean, outside of the top 3 guys that were drafted, has the most home runs, most dingers of anyone in the draft.
Yeah, I think he's definitely the most spectacular player left on the board in terms of like eye-popping kind of player.
Yeah, and I think there's. Here's the funny thing is, I kind of sensed maybe where you were having with the hint that you dropped about only one player being lower than Carpenter, and when you dropped the number, I kind of knew I could get him later because I actually had him 8th on my board. So even though it's been roundabout, we've now have the first 12 picks are the top 12 guys I had on my board.
Wow.
So that is kind of cool. But I think it's one of those at this point. It's like at this point in the draft, he to me was kind of the clear and obvious choice to go with. I mean, I think you said you had him 13, so you would have been taking him fairly soon anyway. But
I actually had him 12th on my board, so
or 12th. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I have a couple guys that have fallen a little bit who I have above him, but yeah, solid pick, definitely a guy. I mean, I think that the drawback to JD Martinez is that really a positionless player. He can like fake it in outfield. He could probably fake it at first base, but mostly as a DH. But a guy who certainly has had the offense to justify being put in that position.
Yeah, I mean, I think a guy that would have benefited if probably if both leagues maybe would have had more value if both leagues had the DH from the get-go for him. But obviously, a lot of his time in the AL anyway, though. So.
Yep. Right. So the lucky number 13 pick, I'm going to draft the guy who the number 17 overall pick. So a slight climb for AJ Pollock. Drafted by the Diamondbacks. That's where he's had the sort of the best years of his career, but he's also played the Dodgers, White Sox. Just kind of a generally like solid type of player. He's an all-star on a Gold Glove. Good player on both sides of the ball. Kind of guy that, and he hasn't necessarily played a lot of corner outfield, but I don't really have a lot of reason to believe that he played some left field, I guess, in the last couple of years, but having a guy who can kind of play around the outfield is a helpful thing to have. And, even if he, in this sort of like, redraft history, alternate history, doesn't become, a guy who's getting MVP votes, a guy that I think is certainly going to be rosterable, kind of a reliable type of player in that regard. That's pretty much where I'm at. He was 7th by CC WAR, which again is a made-up stat. Doesn't matter, but just some food for thought there. So each of my top 7 CC WAR guys are gone, and I think all but one of them is on my team. So again, depending on how much faith people have in a stat that I completely made up, I'm either running away with this draft or it doesn't matter.
I mean, let me assure you and to anybody listening, this does not matter. It is not that serious. However, it's fun. But yeah, I mean, Pollock actually was 13th on my board. So
yeah,
falls in line with where I had him. I think, kind of a, I guess, throwback to a time of center fielders where you didn't necessarily, you wanted to have the better defensive, maybe not the biggest guy hitting tons of home runs. It's kind of, that type of thing. But he was consistent again. Played baseball at Notre Dame. I don't always think of Notre Dame as, a baseball school. But
all due respect to Jeff Samardzija, of course.
Well, I mean,
All-American wide receiver at Notre Dame, Jeff Samardzija.
I mean, to be fair, a really good pitcher too. But it's and he took the money and the low risk of head injury. So,
he ended up making the right move. I remember looking up at one point. This is wildly off draft because Samardzija's not in this draft, but of guys like who were NFL draft picks around the time Samardzija would have been. Basically, Calvin Johnson was the only guy who making more money, and that might not even be any true anymore since he retired early. But
yeah, it makes you wonder. You hear a lot, maybe that's a topic for another thing is drafting, dual sport players that picked one or the other. We can debate them, but yeah, I mean, I think, like we've had in other drafts, we're just going to get to the point in the draft where it's like, yep, he was solid.
Yeah, I think we're kind of in this. That's kind of the interesting thing about this draft is that there is a drop off after the first few guys, but it's not like it's a drop off into like awful players. It's just drop off into pretty good player.
Yeah, I mean, like you're going to see that. You'll see that with players that you don't even necessarily that don't get drafted in this too. But
yeah. All right, so of my top 14 players on my board, 13 of them have been drafted, so we'll see if your number 14 is the one guy that I have left, or if I'm going to get my idea of a steal.
What I will say is that my next pick, I'm a big fan of this guy's first name. That's right, I'm going to take fellow Jason.
Oh, you took him.
I'm going to take Jason Kipnis.
That's the right pick.
So wow, that's weird. That also obviously at my 14. So funny how this is all coming around. But
you gotta love the guy whose nickname is Dirtbag.
I mean, it's a great nickname. Like
it's solid.
Yeah, I mean, and a guy who, until the last year of his career played in Cleveland. Um, longevity, one thing, his, you know, career just, I mean, he stopped in 2020, so only played 10 years. Oh, I think
Yeah,
John's
but
frozen.
was
Oh, okay. Sorry, you were frozen for a sec there. You were talking.
I just had nothing interesting to say. It's okay.
But, you know,
Yeah, Kipnis was a starter for the World Series team. He was just a good player for Cleveland for quite a while.
yeah, 2-time All-Star. Um, that's really all the kind of accolades. Not a guy that's got any Golden Gloves or anything like that. Guy, I
Decent fielder
believe,
though.
yeah, decent fielder. Not a real big guy. I think he's 5'10" or 5'11", 200. So not a huge guy, but
yeah, there is kind of like a lot of like second base type players, Dozier, LeMahieu, Kipnis, those kind of guys. I had Kipnis the lowest of the three, but they're all kind of in a general vicinity, I think.
yeah, like I feel like it's one of those, if you're looking for like that type of player, like if you had any three of them, the thing, yeah, maybe Kipnis doesn't have that the other two had shown more is maybe adaptability to play elsewhere. I think most of him was playing second. Maybe it looks like in a few seasons played some center.
Yeah, he's actually drafted as a center
He
fielder.
was drafted as a center fielder, but didn't play it. It doesn't appear in the majors until 2017 for the first time. So, but
Real Craig Biggio type.
yeah, I mean,
Didn't play catcher though.
true. He didn't make the full transition, but yeah, I mean, it's like I said, solid guy like these other guys. Fell below them just because maybe doesn't have quite the versatility, but a solid guy to have at 14.
Yeah. So for number 15, I am going to go with the versatility. This is just sort of a personal favorite player of mine. Kike Hernandez is my number 15 overall pick. A guy who was initially drafted by the Astros, played with the Marlins, kind of hit his peak with the Dodgers and onto the Red Sox, but guy's proven pretty adept at a lot of different positions. He's played second, shortstop, center field, corner outfield, played some third base. Just sort of the kind of guy that if he's part of your, like, you don't necessarily want him as like a focal point of your offense at one position. But like whenever the Dodgers could get a guy like him going and he could just kind of play anywhere, that was a sign that they were going to be a juggernaut because he kind of had that ability to play all around. He's a little bit like a Tommy Edman type player where he's good enough to start, but you also get a guy who's good enough to just kind of play around, and that's a nice thing to have. He attended the American Military Academy in Puerto Rico, which is not a thing that I knew until I was researching this. Doesn't really have the accolades of a lot of other players. He's never been an all-star, no major awards, but happy to take Kike Hernandez at 15.
Yeah, I mean, I had him a little lower on my board, but it was throw a dart at the board at this point. At this point, I had him at 18, but he did make my top 20. So
yeah,
but yeah, I think at this point, you're probably starting, to take guys that you're like, oh, I just prefer them. I don't even know if I have statistics to back up exactly why I prefer them, but
it's not like a good vibes pick, honestly. And like, there's enough of a statistical case that, and like, I couldn't justify taking him over Jason Kipnis just because he didn't have that kind of like peak. But in terms of a player who, and despite the fact that he got off to kind of a late start, and despite the fact that he was not even like a full-time starter, he actually ranked 20th by CC War. So, which you would think this would be a guy that's kind of like the opposite of what that sort of measures, but turned out pretty well. And we are now on to you at 16.
Now on to me. So I'm going to go with a guy who I don't even really have a reason why I've liked watching him, other than I like saying his name a lot as part of it. And I used to get him confused with another player, the same last name. But I will go with catcher Yan Gomes as my next pick.
He was next on my board. I do want to point out that whenever you were saying you just like saying his name, until you mentioned another player, I thought you were going to go with Jake Marisnik, but I appreciate Yan Gomes as the...
Yeah, I mean, it's, I don't know. And I think I used to always associate him. Do you remember Johnny? Was it Johnny Gomes?
Oh, yeah.
So, like, I always, like, for some reason associated them together. But
shout out to Johnny Gomes, one covered by the other podcast that I have a connection to in Discord. Here's a guy, which you should listen to because they covered him one time. He almost died many times. My fun fact, but we're moving on to Yan Gomes now.
But a guy who I believe for the first time in this draft we have a catcher.
True.
He has a Silver Slugger Award and was an All-Star in 2018. So, there's that. Largely, I think a guy who, when you look at his WAR, might be sort of based just on the fact that he did play so much of catcher. His rookie year is actually really funny because he played a lot of different positions as a rookie before they're like, oh, okay, yeah, no. Then they shipped him to Cleveland, and they're like, oh, yeah, you can catch. And, was a staple there for a while. Went to Washington, and then a year with Oakland, and then been with the Cubs. This is something that I'll be honest, I didn't pay much attention to baseball last year. I did not realize that he played 116 games for the Cubs last year.
Oh, yeah.
So
he's still chugging along.
Yeah, I mean, as we live in this era where kind of, longevity of catchers is maybe a more hotly discussed topic at times within baseball communities and how much to use catcher stuff. But for him to, and obviously 116 games, I don't have the breakdown weren't all at catcher. He was DHing some as well.
Sure.
But, I think anytime, if you have a guy, especially when working with pitching staffs, who has this much experience of catching in the MLB, with Zach Wheeler on the up and up and him, I mean, I think my team could do pretty darn well from that perspective.
Sure.
But, good.
I have two notes on Yan Gomes. One, I believe the first Brazilian player in the history of Major League Baseball, if I'm remembering correctly. And two, this is going to sound like a completely over-the-top comparison. I want to be very clear when I emphasize broke man's when I say this. Kind of a broke man's Mike Piazza in the sense that he is a much better defensive catcher than it seems like. Like, he's not a great defensive catcher, but he's, like, fine. And I think he's always had a reputation as being, like, kind of a butcher framer, being a guy that, like... And probably because he came up and was not immediately a catcher, but, like... He's fine, and good bat for a catcher.
Yeah, I mean the guy who one of those obviously got signed out of the 2009 draft, but was actually also drafted in 2008 in the 39th round, but then looks like switched colleges before he went back one more year and moved himself up 29 rounds. So better way to bet on yourself, Jan. We're proud of you here.
Yeah, good choice. Can't argue against that. Next up, number 17. I'm going to go with a player that once led the American League in home runs. A guy who had 40-plus home runs 3 seasons in a row, as well as batted exactly .247 for 4 seasons in a row. I am going to go with Chris Davis, the KH Chris Davis. A little along the lines probably of like the JD Martinez pick in the sense of like this guy has like no defensive value at all. He is just purely a baseball crusher. Not even necessarily like an amazing player by like advanced stats. He only has a .314 career on base percentage, but a guy that just hit a lot of home runs, and I like having those kind of guys around. And not a whole lot else to that. Kind of how you came and went. There was sort of a certain type of before the archetype of Milwaukee Brewers became big guys, with the Daniel Vogelbachs of the world, the Rowdy Teleses of the world. They also had a sort of the Chris Carter, Eric Thames, and Chris Davis kind of mold of just big dudes that just hit a bunch of home runs. And at the number 17 pick, obviously I'm not looking at somebody who's necessarily going to be a building block of the franchise, but a player who was really a strong hitter for a few years, and if nothing else, a guy who is going to be a lethal pinch hitter for me.
Yeah, he's a guy. I was honestly hoping I could sneak him in later in the draft, maybe the last pick even, just because he's fun to watch. Yeah, I mean, kind of a throwback. My favorite guy to look at in my lifetime watching was Adam Dunn. It's the dude's going he's going to give you nothing in the outfield. He's going to hit a home run. He's going to strike out, or he's going to walk. It's
and Davis doesn't even really have the walks, but
Davis doesn't walk. So.
Two of the true outcomes for sure.
So, but I mean, those guys. I mean, as kids, we grew up, obviously watching, McGuire and Sosa when they would go at it. And as a kid, I didn't care that Mark McGuire was not really good at anything else besides hitting home runs. That's what I wanted. If I was a kid in Milwaukee when Chris Davis was there, I would have been this is the greatest player ever because he just hits a lot of home runs. So.
Yeah. They actually, I mean, now that I think about it, Richie Sexson maybe was a forebearer to that in Milwaukee. They've had a...
Yeah. I mean, and Prince was...
Yeah. I feel he was more of the Vogelbach forebearer, but yeah, that's...
Yeah. I mean, but he did both, though. He hit the ball. World, yeah. Prince hit ball far.
Yes. All right, you're up at number 18.
18. Could go a few different ways here, but I am going to end up taking a guy who will end up sliding, but I like my pitchers who rake. Cardinal connection. I'm going to go with the 8th overall pick in the draft, Mike Leake. Mostly just because I want his name said on this podcast. I won't lie, there's 2 other players that I have, or 3 other players that I have on the board ahead of him, but I just want to talk about Mike Leake.
So number 18, would you say that getting the number 8 pick at number 18 is the steal of the draft?
I mean, you never know. I guess it might be in terms of how we do it, because I don't know. I also got the number 1 pick at 4, so
yeah, but he was never caught shoplifting, so I don't feel like making that joke with him.
Yeah, but Mike Leake has more dingers than Stephen Strasburg, so
that's probably true. Yeah,
it's 100% true. But I remember people being ecstatic in St. Louis when we signed Mike Leake, and I was like, why?
I was not one of those people. I was like, oh, okay.
Yeah, he's never a guy, who blew you off the page for the statistics. Like I said, I just want to talk about him. I mean, he's a guy who pitched 10 years in the MLB.
A number 18 overall pick. You're not picking number 18 thinking, oh, this guy is going to be my age. You're thinking if this guy can be in my rotation for a while, and he was a guy who's in rotation for a while.
Maybe we tell him that the game is some clothing items and he steals us a game. I don't know, but
he started this, so I can't even get mad at you for that.
Yeah, you're gonna say. I mean, you threw it out there. I mean, guy has 301, games in the majors, so you have experience. Had an ERA over 4, so he's not lighting the world on fire. But, like I said, 6 dingers, hit 192. Why not?
And I mean, most of this sort of redraft frame of time is going to be during the National League not having the DH era, so that's a useful thing to have.
I got Strasburg and Leak, man. You're getting 9 tough outs from those 2 starters. I know that's not how this draft is.
I'm not sure about getting 9 of them, but yeah. All right, so number 19 pick. I have a few guys with Cardinals connections right around this spot, but I'm going to go with a guy who doesn't have any Cardinals connections, but does have connections with the first pitcher drafted in this. I'm going to go with Patrick Corbin.
Okay. He's one of the guys that I had above Leak for the record.
Yeah, I mean, and Corbin's one of those guys who his stock has really fallen over the last couple of years because he's been just like awful. Awful. And like unlike Strasburg,
drop off from the NHL.
Well, because like Corbin and Strasburg are both guys who get paid a ton of money Nationals, but like at least Strasburg doesn't actually make public appearances as a pitcher, and Patrick Corbin does, and he's terrible. No. Like there was like legit arguments whenever the Nationals were trading Juan Soto of like, oh, well, maybe you sweeten the pot by agreeing to take Patrick Corbin off their hands. But the thing is, before he had that major drop off, he's a 2-time All-Star. Guy got Cy Young votes twice. Not going to be nearly as long of a peak as some of these guys, hence why he's going 19. But I think just in terms of like peak ability, a guy who is higher up there. I had him number 17 on the CC WAR list, but part of that is because that also requires you to be have good years towards the back end of your club control, and you didn't even really have that. But a guy who was really strong for a while, and at number 19, I'm happy to have him there.
Yeah, I mean, a guy who, like I said, probably higher in this draft if we did it 4 or 5 years ago. I mean,
yeah.
But, he was, oddly enough, 16th on my board. So, and yet I just wanted to have the fun discussion of Mike Leake. But
he was 18th on my board, and yet I signed it up with him. Go figure.
You're just, I don't pretend like that, I'm just a loser in today's episode anyway. I'm still mad at myself about that streaming game at the beginning.
All right. You chance, though, with the final pick.
Yeah, and I feel like I wasted my good fun pick with Mike Leake. Now I'm regretting that.
There's some fun players left on the board.
I mean, there's fun players to discuss, but if I'm being honest with myself, all right, forget it. I'm going to go for the man, the myth, the current Cardinal that we haven't seen him pitch a game yet for the Cardinals who attended the University of Missouri in Columbia, Kyle Gibson.
He was on my board, yeah.
Sorry, Will Myers being the other guy that he was sort of jockeying for position with.
Okay, yeah, I had Myers a little bit lower. I agree with your choice.
Yeah, I mean, it's position versatility on Myers, just to give him a quick shout is another reason. For a guy who was drafted as a catcher and then didn't play as a catcher.
Correct.
But Kyle Gibson, got to show the. I say got to show Mizzou love as if I actually attended the University of Missouri, even though we didn't.
Correct. Yeah.
But drafted in the first round. Drafted, I believe, before Mike Trout.
22nd, yeah.
Yeah, so just before Trout. I mean, a guy who I think you could say is a fair way to describe him. He's been a serviceable MLB pitcher. I mean,
yeah, I think he's of the same kind of like vintage as your last pick, Mike Leake. I think he's a little bit better than Mike Leake, but like that type of pitcher where you're not drafting Kyle Gibson thinking he's going to be your ace unless you're the Orioles and just absolutely desperate for pitching. But he's a guy who as a mid rotation guy, pretty solid to have.
And he's in his mid-30s, so he fits into the Cardinals rotation perfectly.
Yeah, it's kind of bringing a spark of youth into the starting rotations. So each of my top 19 guys on my board, which is as far as I've bothered ranking, got drafted. My number 20 was actually the guy that was drafted one spot before Mike Trout, and that's St. Louis Cardinals legend Randall Grichuk.
Bye.
Kind of like same team as Mike Trout.
Exactly. It's one of those things. Like, do you think they talk about like the fact that they had back-to-back picks? Does it mean anything as far as the order they were drafted in? But man, on broadcast, they love to bring it up when Grichuk was playing.
And it's kind of it's so unfair to Grichuk because like if you look at all the guys drafted before Randall Grichuk, very few of them got drafted here. Like Grichuk had a better career than most of them, and yet because of the immediate proximity to Mike Trout, it's treated like he's like some sort of like he's like the Sam Bowie to Michael Jordan kind of thing. And
yeah, I mean they were literally both outfielders with the same organization. Like
yeah, and Grichuk was always one of those guys where like it was hard not to be frustrated because it felt like he was like a superstar waiting to happen. But even just based on like what he was, like he was a good player and he could play all three outfield positions. He was pretty fast. He had a lot of home run power.
Yeah, I mean, it's longevity with him. I mean, kind of the story of young Cardinal outfielders, it seems. Or we give up on them young and then they turn into Adolis Garcia and Randy Rosarina.
There's that.
Yeah. As a guy who watched a lot of Rosarina play in the minors, and Adolis Garcia too, he wasn't here as long, but yeah. But, like you said, the other two Cardinal proverbial starters in this rotation being Miles Michaelis and Steven Matz were in this draft.
Michaelis was a guy that I had a tough time evaluating because like he has the peak seasons. Like he's the player who didn't get drafted who has the best peak, but kind of going inconsistency with my the C War thing. He is terrible by that because he washed out and went to Japan.
Yeah, he played in Japan. I mean, that's it's a weird thing because it's like, well, it's longevity, but we're doing an MLB draft, not a baseball draft, I guess you could say, in the sense of since he has, time over in is it the NBL, I think is the Japanese league or something like that.
The NPB, you mean?
NPB, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
I think you conflated NPB and KBO.
It's guys, I got 2 kids under 4. It's a miracle that I can get on here and record these podcasts every week. So, but yeah, I think I don't know, some other fun names in here. Billy Hamilton in this draft.
Yeah, Billy. I considered taking a late flyer on Billy Hamilton just because it was tough because like. The fact that he was this really hyped up base stealer and then he came majors and wasn't nearly as efficient as you would hope he would be. But the guy was also like an amazing defensive player. And like Michael A. Taylor was another guy who I kind of circled around who was just like, a Gold Glove winner in center field.
Yeah, I mean, it was a weird one. I mean, even a guy as funny, I think, ranked last in terms of kind of where we did our cutoff in WAR. But like, I remember like being super hyped on Dustin Ackley
coming out. And like he ended up being like he was the number 2 pick. He was not the number 2 player, obviously, but he was like probably like a top 40 guy or something. Like
yeah, I mean, like
he had like a few good years.
And that's the thing. It's like And maybe I was hyped on him because I wanted to be the guy that was a little different, being like, yeah, you think Strasburg's going to be good. Just, you should see this kid at number 2. I don't know. I had a little bit of that in me in my college years. I don't know. I've softened in my old age, but, but yeah, even guys, I mean.
Mike Minor up there, top 10 guys.
Yeah, I mean, Mike Minor, Mike Fiers.
One really awesome year in there, yeah. Mike Fiers, Miles Michaelis, 2 teammates of JD Martinez in college. Brawl was an all-star one time. That was pretty weird.
Yeah, I remember that. When I saw his name, I was like, oh, wow. And then, I mean, okay, as Cardinal fans, we have to talk about Shelby Miller a little bit, right? Like,
yeah, if you had told me 10 years ago tonight that Shelby Miller was not going to be in the top 20, I would have thought that was absurd because he was coming off of being a Rookie of the Year finalist. He wasn't as good his second year, but he bounced, like, once he got traded to Atlanta, he bounced back in a big way and then was part of the weekend of one of the most lopsided trades in modern history when he got traded to Arizona.
Yeah.
Just, and he's found actually decent footing in the last couple of years as a relief pitcher, which I'm happy for him. The fact that he's still pitching in the major leagues means he's not like a total bust or anything, but it kind of seemed for a while that there were going to be very few teams that really, it was obvious by the end of 2012 that Mike Trout would be number 1 in this draft. Yeah. But it kind of seemed like the Cardinals would be one of the few teams that would not have that strong of regrets about it, but obviously knowing what we know now, there's a bit of a gap between Mike Trout and Shelby Miller.
Yeah, just a little bit. But yeah, I mean, overall, pretty fun draft. I mean, I'm finding that as we do this, it's, at least in the 3 we've done so far, I think basketball is going to be a whole different animal in a different way because we're going to go from the draft that has tons and tons of guys to.
Yeah, we don't want to give away which draft. We don't want to give which draft is coming up next, but is probably my favorite draft in any sport in terms of watching the draft. So I'm excited for that. And also, we're going to have a couple special guests for it. So.
Yeah, I mean, get excited, guys. The Draft Day podcast is getting bigger.
Expanded universe. Yeah, we haven't gone on long enough with these with just 2 people. Now we'll see what happens when we add some extra factors.
Get ready for the 2.5-hour episode. Episode 4, y'all.
It's going to be longer than the entire draft of that year, but that's okay. We'll have a good time.
Yeah, it'll be fun, and appreciate you guys taking the ride with us. Be sure to follow us on Twitter, X, at Draft Day Pod. If you feel so inclined, you can be like, our Facebook page as well, which is just Draft Day Podcast. Feel free to follow me and become like my 4th follower at Draft Day Dadshaw. And you can follow John on there as well at JohnJF125. Any closing thoughts you have, John, before we, see him next time?
Not really. I do think we should probably recap the picks.
Good call.
Jason's wielding a lightsaber of some sort right now, so I'm going to be very careful as I
am.
Provide these. The Vader mask.
Vader mask. This is how my son, he's like, Dad, I'm going to go get dressed this morning. And he ran into his room and then came out wielding the Darth Vader mask and the lightsaber and started attacking me at 6 o'clock in the morning. I was not awake enough for that, but it's also my fault.
I mean, I get attacked by my dog at 6 o'clock in the morning. Can't say there was a Vader mask involved, but
not yet.
Mostly just had to get up and give him food. So anyway, the picks. Team John is Mike Trout, Nolan Arenado, Kyle Seager, Matt Carpenter, Dallas Keuchel, Brian Dozier, AJ Pollock, Kike Hernandez, Chris Davis, Patrick Corbin. Team Jason is Paul Goldschmidt, Stephen Strasburg, Brandon Belt, DJ LeMahieu, Zach Wheeler, JD Martinez, Jason Kipnis, Jan Gomes, Mike Leake, and Kyle Gibson. that is another sport that we have waded into. I'm going to be covering all sorts of sports here. May occasionally do some non-sports drafts. Hopefully, those who enjoyed our looking at Spotify plays earlier will be ready for that. But we'll round out the big four sports with our next episode, and see where this goes from there.
Sounds good. Well, pleasure as always, John, and we'll talk to you guys next time.
All right. Bye, everybody.